Welcome, everyone. Welcome to a webinar featuring a discussion with Minister Natan Sharansky and Dr. Gil Troy, highlighting their recent book, Never Alone. This webinar is presented by the AZM, American Zionist Movement. The American Zionist Movement is comprised of 33 national Jewish Zionist organizations. It works across a broad ideological, political, and religious spectrum, linking the American Jewish community together in support of Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish people. The AZM is the U.S. Zionist Federation in the World Zionist Organization and recently facilitated the U.S. election to the World Zionist Congress. I am Susan Longo, a vice president of the AZM and a representative of ARTZA, the Association of Reformed Zionists of America. I will be your moderator for this webinar. Never Alone tells one of the most inspiring Zionist stories of our time, the story of Natan Sharansky. The book is also a love letter to Israel and the Jewish people, a memoir of what it's like to go from a dictatorship to democracy, from prison into politics, and from political deal-making into Jewish identity building. Most of us know Natan Sharansky, and therefore he really needs no introduction. His perspective on as a human rights activist and a leader for the struggle of the rights of Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel, as an Israeli politician serving as a minister and deputy minister for 4 successive Israeli governments, and as chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel, he brings a richness of these 3 perspectives to any discussion of the relationship of diaspora Jewry to Israel. In 2018, he received the highest Israeli award, the Israel Prize for Promoting Aliyah and the Ingathering of Exiles. He is also the recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the only living non-American citizen to receive 2 of the United States' highest awards. In July 2019, he became chairman of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Natan Sharansky is also the author of 4 books: Fear No Evil, The Case for Democracy, Defending Identity, and the most recent, Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People. Dr. Gil Troy is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, currently living in Jerusalem. Dr. Troy is the author of The Age of Clinton, America in the 1990s, and 8 other books on the American presidency. He's also edited and updated the multi-volume History of American Presidential Campaigns. And with Natan Sharansky, Dr. Troy co-authored Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People. A bit of housekeeping. We have currently disabled the chat function in Zoom, but you may pose questions to our 2 authors in the Q&A function. We'll get to as many of those questions as our 1-hour format permits. The webinar is also being recorded and will be available for viewing on our website and social media pages after this webinar. It's also being streamed on Facebook Live, and we will send out a link to everyone at the conclusion of our program. And at this time, I'll turn the webinar over to Dr. Gil Troy.
Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Herbert Block, Richard Heidemann, the president of the AZM, and Alicia Post. You're a dream team. You've put together an extraordinary event. We appreciate all the books that you've sold and all the books you will sell. But more than that, the AZM in some ways makes our job easy, because the central idea of the book is to acknowledge difference, but also to build bridges and to find a platform where we can agree and not just disagree. And the fact that you have a coalition of 33 organizations from left to right, religious, non-religious, is really the power of the Zionist movement and the power of the American Zionist movement. And that's one of the central themes of the book and frankly of Natan Sharansky's life and of my life, trying to kind of figure out a way to lean in when we disagree, But also we know that we can blow up any conversation by only emphasizing our disagreements and finding that beautiful path, that Shvil Zahav, that golden path to understanding the power of Jewish peoplehood and our common goals. And that's also, in a sense, the title of the book, Never Alone. It comes from the years that Natan Sharansky was in the Gulag, and the KGB kept on telling him, you're forgotten, you're abandoned, you're lost. And he said that he knew, even though he was in isolation for months on end, even though he had very few visitors, he knew he was never alone because he had the Jewish people with him. And many of those Jewish people were indeed many of you who are on the call, and much of the Zionist movement that was with the Soviet Jewish movement. And it's one of our great successes that we don't tell enough about to our children and our grandchildren. But before we get to the book, let's talk a little bit about something that's on everybody's mind, the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Natan, you as the 2020 Genesis Prize winner, and as someone who's been involved in the Genesis Foundation for a while, had the privilege of hosting the 2018 Genesis Lifetime Achievement Award winner in Jerusalem a few years back. And her name, if I recall, was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that moment?
Yes, thank you. And I'll be very glad now to share some memories about it. But first of all, Shana Tova to everybody. And I hope that this year will give a lot of health and security and confidence to us personally and as people. You know, if you notice, Gil, you said that I received Genesis Prize Award, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg received Life Achievement Award, Genesis Prize Achievement. What is the difference? The difference is, and that's a really interesting story. From the beginning, I was one of the founders of this prize, and there were three bodies which formed this prize. It's the Genesis Foundation, it is the government, and Jewish Agency. And when there is a short list of candidates, before you bring it to the final decision, you check with the candidates whether if they will be voted, will they agree to accept the prize, and will they agree to accept the fact that you have also to work to promote these values and so on. And it's very rare, but sometimes people say, no, it's not really, I'm not ready for this. But very rare, but such things happen. In case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she, from the very beginning, she was very high. Year after year, she was very high on the short list. But when Stan Polovitz, the director of all this project, came to her, she said, I really want very much. It will be a big honor for me to receive this prize because it is a Jewish prize, and it is has to be received in Israel, and it's a big honor, but I have to check with the authorities. And she went and checked, and they said no to her. Why? Because American judge from the Supreme Court cannot get the award which involves the government. And one of our partners is the government of Israel. And she simply, in a very informal way, but one of her remarks about it was, but why President Obama could get the prize from Norwegian government and I cannot? What it says, she really was upset that she cannot receive it. And then, in fact, we invented, like a couple of years after this, we invented this formula that all the receivers of the prize vote and choose the life achievement, and now she's the only one. And when she came for this ceremony to receive the prize, and I had an honor to take her to the old city to see some very important historical places for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims. Not only she was very alert to everything, she was understood everything. And if you think that she's a little bit distracted, you know, she was already ill, it was difficult for her to keep her head and so, but she got all the jokes and she responded with the jokes. But what was interesting, you can see really how proud she is to receive Jewish prize in Israel. So that's what so we should never underestimate. I don't know how much he talked in daily life about her connection with Israel, Really not a lot, but it was so clear that she is really proud that Jewish people and the state of Israel recognize her, let's say frankly, absolutely unique contribution to the cause of human rights in the United States of America.
So Obama gets the International Nobel Prize, she gets the Jewish Nobel Prize, and now you also get the what they've called the Jewish Nobel Prize, and I, as a very objective observer, think it's well deserved. So now to the book. The question that people keep on asking us is, how does it work? How do you write a book together? And the truth is, I'm an American historian, and I don't play in the sandbox with anybody else. I usually write by myself. But when Natan asked me to be his co-author on this book, I said, you know, the KGB couldn't say no to Natan. How can I say no to Natan? But it was a real privilege, a real honor. We argued about every word, every idea, how to structure every idea, how to explain every idea, how to tell the story. But what's interesting is ideologically, we were on the same page. And I think that also goes to the theme of the AZM and the theme of the book, which is that, look, I was born in New York in freedom. Natan was born in a town called Stalino in that vast prison camp. And yet we have a common peoplehood platform, and that's the power of the Zionist movement. So, and it took 3 years of back and forth. And people think it's a memoir, and it looks like a memoir, but we call it a kind of memoir festo, because we're using stories from Natan's life to tell a broader idea. And it is in many ways a Zionist manifesto. And I love, Susan, how you called it a love letter to the Jewish people and the state of Israel. So let's really start at that point. Natan, you grow up in this town called Stalino. You grow up to be a chess champion and a physicist and mathematician. What do you know about Israel and Zionism? And where do you find out about Israel and Zionism in the vacuum called the Soviet Union?
Well, you know, I was really lucky because I had zero identity and zero freedom when I was growing in the Soviet Union. Zero identity because there was nothing Jewish, no holidays, no language, no religion, no tradition, no knowledge about all this. And the only Jewish thing which was is anti-Semitism. And there was a lot of it. And there was, of course, zero freedom. And we knew very well that we have to say what we are supposed to say and to read what we are permitted to read and to vote as everybody votes. But all this is lie. But the truth you can share only inside your family very close. And the only thing that you know have as the aim in your life is to have a successful career, because your parents explain that because you're Jew, you have to be the best in physics or mathematics or chess or music, because that is the way of Jewish survival. And to think that maybe you should fight against injustice, against anti-Semitism, against the lack of freedom, after all, it's so uncomfortable to live in permanent self-censorship. You're not thinking about it because you have no other value except from the value of physical survival and as a result, professional success. And it all changed in 1967 when, because of Six-Day War, Israel entered our lives. And I can't say that because of my pride for Israel, it changed my life. What changed my life is that everybody looks, those who love you and those who hate you, friends and enemies, looks at you and say, how you guys did it? And everybody is absolutely appalled, and that's such a humiliation to the Soviet Union. And you think, why these people say how you did it? Why I'm not loyal Soviet citizen? Why my Jewishness makes them to think that I am part of Israel? And that's in fact what brought me to really want to read the books about myself, books which American Jews as tourists were bringing to us to Soviet Union. And when you start reading, and when you suddenly discover that with some twist in your mind, you can have very different history of yours, not history of Bolshevik revolution and all this double think and constant lies and so on, but the history which starts from Exodus from Egypt and goes all the way to Exodus of Leon Uris, very important book then for us, through which we are discovering the modern Zionism. And not only the history, all these people who are coming and they're saying, you know, my father is also from Odessa, like your father. We are family, we want to help. You find out that if you decide to have a big family and you have the state of Israel, which is ready to do everything to help you to be free. So that's when you discover your identity. That gives you strength to start saying things that you really believe in, like, I really don't want to live here, I want to go to Israel. And then you have strength to start speaking what you think and fighting for your rights, for rights of other Jews, and then for rights of everybody. That's how I became the activist and then spokesman of two movements, Zionist movement and human rights movement in the Soviet Union. So for me, it was the discovery of these two things together, identity and freedom, and their connection was so obvious. And then, and here I'm coming to the title of this book, when I was in prison, all my strength was from this feeling that all Jewish people are fighting for my religion, that I'm part of a historic, huge historic struggle. The fact that for a few years I was activist and met with many of them was giving me confidence that the struggle continues. And it was so easy then to feel yourself connected to every Jew in the world. If in prison somebody will dare to ask me, but whom you prefer, Reformer, Conservative, or Orthodox, Likud or Labor, you will not even understand what he's talking about, because all the power is coming from this feeling that we are all one fighting family. And so then, after this, in the government, in Jewish agency, it is so much more difficult to have this feeling of connection to all the Jews. And in fact, that became like my obsession as a politician, then my obsession of the head of Jewish agency. And that is our obsession in the book with you, Gil, how in spite of all our differences, in spite of all the sometimes very bitter feelings of betrayal of one another, how our desire to be one family is much stronger, and how we can really continue our journey together. So this feeling, never alone, which was the strongest in prison, that was maybe the most important feeling of unity, of connectedness of our Zionist Jewish family, that I kept on, made my best to keep all my life. And that's what we are trying to say in our book. That's true. That's not only memoirs, but first of all, it's manifesto. Manifesto, how it is important for us to continue our journey together.
So you're being doubly countercultural here, because on the one hand, we're constantly being told I have to choose between my commitment to Zionism and my commitment to human rights or social justice. I have to choose between identity and freedom. I have to choose between loyalty to the state of Israel and fighting the good fight. And you're saying, no, we can integrate the two. And we're also being told that we have nothing to talk about one another. If somebody dares disagree with me, I end the conversation. And you're being very annoying and saying, no, maybe that can be the start of the conversation. So let's go in those two directions. One, how do you synthesize?
Again, I was lucky because I found this or met this pressure from to the opposite sides very early when I was a Jewish and human rights activist in the Soviet Union. There was very strong pressure, sometimes from my Israeli, I wouldn't say patrons, but those who from Israel was supporting us and organizing support to us, that the pressure was to stop dealing with other causes, because we cannot afford ourselves, we should not provoke our enemies. And what's most important, that we finally have our aim to go to our state, to build our state. Why to deal with the general questions of universal freedom, what good it did to us in the past. And on the other hand, I heard many times from some very respectable human rights activists that you have to decide. If you're a real human rights activist, you cannot be nationalist. After all, are you interested in the promoting of the freedom for everybody, or only for your own tribe? And so you have to choose. From both sides, the message was you have to choose. And we write about it in our book, because Soviet Jewry movement seems like such a universal movement without any friction. There was a lot of frictions in America and in Israel and in Soviet Union. And I was personally put under this dilemma, choose between these two. And I felt very strongly from the beginning that it's wrong even to choose, because if I have strength to be universalist, to speak for human rights after all these years of double think and cowardness and being afraid to speak freely my mind, it's only because I have my identity. It's only I have my people behind me. It's only because I'm confident in my future. That's what gives me strength to be also universalist. And so with all those different challenges which I face and you face, because in fact it's really our mutual manifesto. We feel very strongly that we Jews in America and we Jews in Israel, and we don't have to choose. We don't have luxury to choose between our identity and our liberalism. Jewish democratic state has a challenge how to keep them both together, how not to prefer one for the other. And that's also the challenge for Jewish people during all our history until this day.
So it's interesting also because one of the tensions, we actually go into the book and we show that you can be a loving critic, because we do indeed tell the story of very uncomfortable conversations you, Natan, had with representatives of the Israeli government. And Avital had with the representatives of the Israeli government. And just because you criticize what they say at that moment, just because you disagree with what they say at that moment, you don't give up on Israel, right? And I think that's unfortunately a message that isn't conveyed often to our students on campus and to many of our colleagues and friends, that you can disagree in a democratic context with something that's going on, but you don't delegitimize, you don't wipe your hands of it. Now let's talk a little bit more about this dialogue, because it's easy to call for a dialogue, but how do you build it? And how do you make sure that it's not just some sort of kumbaya cry for, you know, a cliche of let's all love one another, but what when you talk about that word keeps on coming up again and again in the book, what do we mean by dialogue? And how do we achieve that?
Well, first of all, you have to feel very strongly that there is something what unites us, that you do want to be part of Jewish family. And for you, it is important that Jewish family will continue its march through civilizations. Because if your identity is not really important for you, or you really don't care, and look, that's no suggestion. Sometimes I ask, well, you know, I don't know, my son is now goes to the university and there is such an anti-Israeli atmosphere. How to make him proud for being Jewish? And I think it's a little bit late. That if he or she had no interest in her own Jewishness, if it was only like paying taxes to your grandfather and grandmother, that okay, you have to do something when you're 13 years old, then it's lost cause. But if by some reasons, by reasons of history, by reasons of faith, by reasons of the family atmosphere, or you discover that your Jewishness is important for you and Jewish family is important for you, then we have a lot to discuss about. And then when we started out, and we bring some critical situations in our book when some leaders of Israel state say that they, meaning Jews of diaspora, betrayed us, or when betrayed the Jewish state, or when the leaders of the diaspora tell, you hear them say, well, Jewish state betrayed Jewish values. It is very important. So wait, if it is part of your family, understand why they're doing it. First of all, understand what. And when you start understanding, try to find what considerations made them to do it or to think so concerning about the future of Jewish people. Then you will not accept it. Or I had a lot of disagreements with my closest political partners and with some of dearest friends in diaspora. But the moment you start understanding, at least partially, why these people also believe that is for the better of Jewish people, then you can start discussing, okay, where we can maybe accept your logic and do something to help you, and where you have to accept the logic of ours. And well, we are speaking about some specific constructions, how to organize this dialogue, but more important is to understand the need of this dialogue, that we cannot, if you really, Jewish future is important for us, we can't think about divorce. We can't think in terms of, okay, we are those who will continue Jewish values, and let's forget about the others. And in fact, we are keeping these Jewish values only together, only by fighting with one another, arguing with one another, and at the same time being united around our Zionist ideal.
So to hijack a metaphor from a previous book and use something that's very timely today, if we think of the shofar, each one of us from our particular organization, from our particular perspective, blows through a very small hole, but ultimately it goes out to a much broader cry, and that's the dance, that we're not negating difference, but we're figuring out also how to always remember that common cry and that common history. Yeah. And I think that's often missing with our college campus, with our students. And I agree with you. People often yell at me and say, what about the students? And I yell back and say, what about the parents? Have they come to campus prepared? Have they with a sense of pride? But we also know that it's a very difficult situation on college campus today. Give us a quick sense, things getting better, things getting worse. What can we do about it? Because I think there's a lot of hand-wringing. The question is, what can we actually do to help?
Well, in 2004, and we write about it, at the time of Second Intifada, I had, as a minister in Israel government, I had a tour on American campuses, and I was shocked by the fact that just in the time when we are in the middle of the struggle against world terror, in fact, and when we have hundreds of victims of the suicide bombing in the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and so on, I hear from some students that they are ashamed to show any connection to Israel. One student who told me that as a liberal Jew, for me, it will be better if Israel doesn't exist. And most frightening, a number of serious Jews who love Israel, for whom their Jewishness is important, but say that because of career considerations, they prefer not to sign the letter about disinvestment, that's how it was called, against boycott of Israel, and so on and so on. And to see this double thing, this fear, not in Moscow in my days, but in Harvard, on Columbia University, on Rutgers, was very surprising, not so unpleasant. At the same time, you could see the really very Zionist groups, even in the most difficult campuses like Berkeley or San Francisco State University, not speaking about, of course, Harvard and Columbia University, groups of fighters. And I then came to Ariel Sharon and said, I believe the most important battlefield for the future of Jewish people, except from Israel, of course, is American universities. And that's where the project of Israeli Fellows campuses were born. And the Israeli Fellows on campuses, many of you know, it's shlichim who are sent Jewish agency through Hillel to date more than 100 universities to support Zionist activity. And what I am saying always to them, that your aim is not to convince our enemies that we are not bad people. Your aim is to give a feeling to young Jews that they have nothing to be ashamed of this connection to Jewish people in Israel. They can be only proud of it. They can have a lot of disagreements, as we all have a lot of disagreements about specific politics, but the fact of the existence of Jewish state and the fact of existence of strong Jewish community is such so important. You can be very proud to be part of it. And then, of course, the challenge is how you're strengthening it. And here, American Jews who invented birthrights, and we have a big chapter telling about the history, how it was developed and how Israel government became supportive. And here, by the way, Bibi Netanyahu has a special role to play to support the initiative of Charles Bronfman and Michael Steinhardt. And of course, all types of Messiah and other programs of Israeli experiences are very important. And bringing Israel to the campuses is very important. But as we discovered in the last years in America and in the campus culture, it is when anti-Semitism rising on the left and the right simultaneously, and it really goes simultaneously, it's so easy to criticize anti-Semitism in the political camp of your opponents, and it is so difficult to criticize anti-Semitism in your own political camp. And what is really important is to be able to see the evil of anti-Semitism in all its forms, against Jewish people and against the state of Israel, and to be ready to face and fight it among your close political allies. And that's a challenge, and no doubt in these days, it's even a more difficult challenge. But well,
you in your book, you call anti-Semitism a most plastic hatred. So how do you help people actually distinguish between today's version of anti-Semitism and criticism, legitimate criticism of Israel?
Well, many years ago, again, we were writing.
Natan, so
Yeah.
just to explain the metaphor.
Just dealing with this problem, I proposed so-called 3D principle: demonization, double standard, and delegitimization of the state of Israel. These are the weapons which were used for thousands of years against Jews, and we can give many examples. And now they are used against the state of Israel. So let's say you disagree with the policy of Israel towards Palestinians, and you think that the fact that there are still refugee camps for Palestinians, that's a shame. And I can disagree with, I agree that it's a shame, but I can debate with you who is to blame for this. That's legitimate. But when the big moral authority comes to Israel, says, I was in a refugee camp, that is Auschwitz of today, that's demonization. I was many times in a refugee camp, and it's a very bad place, and it's very bad that they exist, and we have to discuss every day who has to be blamed and what has to be done, but it has nothing to do with Auschwitz. And so there are many examples of this demonization, double standard, and delegitimization of the state of Israel. And thanks God now, then there was accepted with the time, there was a big debate about it, but with the time there was accepted international definition of anti-Semitism, where all these 3Ds were included in it. And at this very moment, the struggle is on the campuses to accept this definition or not. Just a few days ago, I think, in Arizona, the university accepted this, some others deny, but I agree that it is very important, first of all, to when you go to 3D film, to put 3D spectacles. When you go to the reality of today's campus, for example, to use the 3D spectacles of anti-Semitism and to see where there is legitimate debate and criticism and discussion and argument, and where there is systematic attempt to delegitimize Israel, to boycott Israel, to apply double standards to Israel, and to invent all types of demonization.
So there are three takeaways here, Susan, if I may. One
Sure.
is that when we call it the most plastic hatred, we're remembering our late friend Robert Wistrich, who called anti-Semitism the longest hatred, meaning the oldest hatred. It goes back thousands of years. And we're calling it the most plastic hatred because it works for the right and it works for the left. In fact, I feel like we're giving a big gift to the left and the right. They disagree on so many things. They can sometimes agree, the extremists, on hating Jews. But like plastic, it can change forms. It's malleable. It's artificial because it's often based on lies, and it can often be toxic if you eat it. So that's why we call it the most plastic hatred. We're calling for, especially for an organization like AZM, to have very clear red lines about what is anti-Semitism, what is Jew hatred. And it doesn't matter who is the Jew hater. It matters if bigotry is wrong. And we have to have clear red lines for all kinds of bigotry. And we need especially our friends on the left to fight left-wing anti-Semitism, and our friends on the right to fight right-wing anti-Semitism. And finally, the sifting campaign that Natan started over 20 years ago, unfortunately has to continue. But one of the things we also emphasize is that on campus, when it comes to discrimination against African Americans, the burden is on the person who said the thing, the person who might have offended, not on the African American. The burden is on the anti-feminist, not the feminist. The burden is on the homophobe, not the gay person. How come all of a sudden we have to prove, it's our job to do the work to somehow say, oh, well, yes, you're truly anti-Semitic. If you dip into this ugly pool of historic libels, of historic hatreds, of historic images, and you demonize, you delegitimize, you hold Israel to double standards, and you treat Israel as the big obsession, the big problem, the Jew of the world, then somehow or other, it's on you to prove that you're not anti-Semitic. And all too often, you've fallen into that hole. And we shouldn't be spending, I mean, we need to spend the time because we all haven't done a good job. But fundamentally, we need to have very clear lines, but ultimately also to just go back to the very beginning of what Natan was saying, we're also talking about what I call Pilates Judaism, Pilates Zionism. First, strengthen the core. We spend so much time worrying about the haters. We spend so much time worrying about the very small number of anti-Zionist Jews. But when Natan talks about what we call the Ivy League double thinkers, the people from Harvard and Yale and SUNY Binghamton and who are so smart and so accomplished and yet so scared to stand up for Israel, they're not anti-Israel, but they're being attacked by this cancel culture of the left and the right, and we have to support them too, and we have to make sure they have a strong sense of identity, and from there they'll fight for our cause and for themselves.
Another really deep question that I'm not sure we can all solve in the remaining time that we have, but you say in the book that Israel's existential question is, how do we survive so many hostile dictatorships and terrorist groups seeking our destruction, and yet control the lives of millions of Palestinians? So can you speak to our identity here as a pluralistic democratic society, and yet for others we can see a group of people that within the country don't have those same sort of rights?
Well, that's a big question, and we are debating these things for months and years. And by the way, we spend a lot of time also on this book to clarify our positions on these issues too. Here, shortly, I want to say, I always believed, long before it became accepted, I believed that it is our interest that Palestinians will have their own state. And as I said, in '88, I think, in the interview to Newsweek, 2 years after I was released from prison, I want that Palestinians will have the same rights as you in everything, but for sure I don't want them to have opportunity to destroy me. And here comes the problem. How we stop controlling the lives of these people, and at the same time, don't strengthen those who want to destroy us. And that's a long process and difficult process. Unfortunately, what is called peace process, I never believed in it because it was all built on the idea, and I speak now about Oslo, and we spoke. I wrote an article criticizing Oslo 1 week after it was signed, when everybody was happy, and I also was happy that we start this process. But the moment it became clear, and our leaders very clearly, that it's good that Arafat is a dictator. We want him as a dictator. We want that he will be our dictator. We will give him a lot of money in order he will be our dictator. And the one, I quote, who is not controlled by free press, human rights organizations, and Supreme Court will defeat Hamas much better than we can do it. And that's when I said that all this idea that we will find appropriate dictator, impose it on him on Palestinians, and it will bring us peace, I don't believe in it. The peace has to be built from bottom up, and we have to be interested in strengthening civil society on Palestinian side. And the rest, I will not go into the details because it's big debates. I had these debates with different governments. I was proposing Marshall Plan for Palestinians and going towards free elections on the Palestinian side a number of times. We didn't go in this direction. Palestinian leaders definitely were never interested to go in this direction. I think that there are some signs which make us optimistic. The fact that in the last years, Palestinian economy becomes more independent. that there are step-by-step appear some joint ventures. And of course, the fact that they started in the last weeks, they started normalization with some Arab countries, which I believe that is the right way to bring peace and to bring solution to Palestinian problem and to help them to have a state which will not withstand danger to us through normalization, through people-to-people contacts, through joint ventures, and in the end, elections which bring their leaders who are interested in the well-being of Palestinians and not interested how they can destroy us.
So we're not naive. We point out that the great crime that was committed by Oslo against the Palestinians was imposing people like Arafat, the terrorist, on his people and creating a fierce society there. And we're well aware that the new agreements with the UAE and Bahrain are also with autocrats. But the difference is that, as Natan said, this is a peace that isn't from the top down, but it's from the bottom up. Look, if Israel said it's never going to make any peace with autocrats, and it's only going to make peace with democracies, it would be very, very lonely, right? So that's not the critique of Oslo. The critique of Oslo was not only imposition of the fierce society, but that it wasn't a bottom-up process. And we've seen that the Palestinian movement, their leadership, is committed to anti-normalization, which means the most basic attempt to create some kind of conversation, some kind of dialogue, some kind of artistic sharing or business deal is somehow, it seemed to be unkosher, problematic, evil from their perspective. And we've seen with Bahrain and the UAE, and hopefully there's going to be a positive domino effect of other countries coming in, where if you build the ties from below, you're not going to have perfection, but you're going to at least have some kind of multidimensional connection and multidimensional peace, and that's going to be more resilient and that's going to be more relevant. But of course, let's also not be cynical. And I always say, and we make this very clear in the book, even though we don't get to the UAE piece because it hadn't happened yet, that what's this really about? Three things: Iran, Iran, and Iran. That the and this of course is also a flashpoint between some elements of American Jewry and Israel. Israelis very much feel the justified, I would say, fear against Iran and its theocracy and its anti-human rights regime and its push for nuclear weaponry, and the allegiance that has emerged is very much built from the bottom up, but it's also built from the fear of Iran and the Shia troubles there.
Thank you. If we look at another aspect of Israeli history, clearly at the very beginning, a combination of secular Jews and socialist politics were in the founding group. And as the country has matured, it has become more, if you will, traditional. In your view, is traditional Jewish identity the core of what it takes to be a Zionist, or are the various other streams equally, in your view, committed to this journey together?
Well, for us it's clear, and we speak about it, and I acted in accordance with this, that all the ways of Jewish life have to find their expression in Israel. And we cannot decide for different groups in the diaspora what is the best way for them for survival as Jews. They found these ways, and if now they want to find home in Israel, not only for themselves, but for their community, for their rabbis and so on, Israel's obligation is to have room for everybody. Now, you mentioned this like a positive thing, that there was secular socials past, and now we have Orthodox green future. Although the one who defined all these state and religion status quo, was Ben-Gurion, the one who decided that if Reformed want to have the full rights, let 300,000 Jews, as he said, to come to make the end, then we will talk. And I don't criticize now, and we make clear that we don't know whether Ben-Gurion had a different way. After all, books were not written how to build state after thousands of years of exile. But the fact is that these the status quo agreement, which really almost delegitimized non-Orthodox Judaism. It started from the beginning of the State of Israel. And of course, the time is changing. And it's definitely time for Israel also to change many of these approaches. And I'm sure that we're moving in the right direction, but sometimes are very almost tragic setbacks. And it's not accidental that the whole chapter in this book is about total crisis or total compromise with this great discussion, which we had for a few years discussing this compromise. And on the request of Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, I started it, and we brought all the sides to the negotiation table, and also with the full support of Prime Minister, finally this compromise was accepted. And then, unfortunately, because of narrow considerations of coalition, Prime Minister retreated from this, betrayed it. And that's maybe the pages of the most harsh criticism which I have about my friend, and the one who helped me personally and my wife a lot in the past, and who did so much for Israel in the economy and the fighting against Iran, Bibi Netanyahu. But there are things which have to be criticized, and one of them, of course, what happened with the total compromise.
Our pluralistic vision is absolutely one that's respectful to Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, Reform, quote unquote, secular, although I say I've rarely met a truly secular Israeli because they speak Hebrew beautifully. 80% of them raise a glass at Shabbat dinner, and they call it Shabbat dinner, and won't be caught in a restaurant. I mean, these days, certainly not, but on Friday night. And just this.
And everybody fasts on Yom Kippur. And on Yom Kippur,
right. And just 2 hours ago, I was on a business call with a friend of mine who was telling me about a new investment fund he's launching. And before he started, he talked about the beauty of walking around his neighborhood on Rosh Hashanah and hearing the shofar blowing doo, 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 from this one and that one and that one because of all the garden minions that have popped up. And so we're very much in favor of pluralism, very much in favor of the Jewishness of this state. But we also are in favor of making sure that every single citizen of Israel, including Arabs, has full rights, and that every group, however it chooses to express its Judaism, while having a public space for Judaism, also has the private freedom to express itself. And that goes back to Natan's opening answer about identity and freedom. Are they sometimes in creative tension? Yes, but this either-orness that people are pushing us to choose or Jewish or democratic goes totally against the spirit of Zionism, the spirit of Judaism, and the spirit of the book. We're trying to build bridges. And that's, of course, the spirit of your organization as well.
And would you speak to the issue of the settlements and what has happened in terms of a campaign promise and then the backing off of that campaign promise by the premier about incorporating the settlements into Israel, the annexation issue?
Well, look, I believe that in the end, when there will be a peace agreement and when there will be two states, no doubt there will be some parts of Judea and Samaria which will become part of Israel's state, and many which will not. And even the most, let's say, liberal projects of the future, majority of the settlements of today, or people living in the settlements, will remain in Judea and Samaria. But if one thinks that it is because of right-wing left-wing opposition, Trump plan didn't become a reality, it's wrong. It's because of right-wing opposition, because Bibi Netanyahu was ready to accept the idea that Israel negotiates the creation of a Palestinian state. But in order to make Palestinians feel that the time is playing against them, as Trump plan foresaw, on one hand, an economical help to Palestinians, on the other hand, that Israel starts taking control over it has control, but in the territories which believes in any way the final solution will be theirs. The thing is that when Bibi was ready to agree and accept, the leaders of the right wing, even his coalition, but to the right from Bibi, said, no, we are not ready to negotiate creation of Palestinian state. And that's why it stopped. And I think it's good that it stopped, because it is much better to start the process from real normalization and bringing it from bottom up and making it a mutual decision. Now, the fact that there are really very little minority, I believe, who is not ready, that even in the conditions of absolute security, even in conditions when the Palestinian state will not have its army, they're against this. It's a real minority. I would say if something happened with Israel society in the last 30 years, is on one hand that majority of Israelis accept the idea that we should not control the lives of millions of Palestinians, that they should have entity of their own, and at the same time, majority of Israelis agreed finally that we should not have any one-sided concessions like disengagement. I think nobody can make new disengagements today without agreement with Palestinians, but also overwhelming majority will accept that Palestinians must have the life of their own and the state of their own.
I think the Zionist movement makes a terrible mistake by falling into the language of settlements, because there are very different kinds of settlements. And the Palestinians, the Palestinian extremists, when they talk about settlements, they often look at Hadera and Haifa, and certainly Jerusalem as a settlement too. And one of the things you can see from the different positions Natan took over the years when he was in government is that Jerusalem is part of our historic homeland, our historic heritage. That's one dimension of the settlement issue. There are security issues, which was some of the things that motivated him when he resigned from the Ariel Sharon government to protest the unilateral Gaza disengagement. That was his major worry, wasn't some kind of historic tie, but more simply defense of the people and allowing Hamas and others to come in and turn Gaza into the world's largest missile launching pad. There are other settlements which are done for political reasons as outposts. And I don't want to go into too much detail in it, but I think it is worth thinking a little bit as a movement, how we sometimes fall into the language of the critics and of our enemies, and we do have enemies, and don't make enough subtle differences so we can create a basis for when there is negotiation, when there is a negotiating partner, to sift between the old city of Jerusalem, Western Jerusalem, expansion of Jerusalem, and other parts.
Gil, I have a great example. That just occurred to me. I have a great example. When we started our negotiations about alternative praying place at the Western Wall, and we started discussions, and some of the things were published, that the idea is to have on the other side of Mugrabi, near the Kotel, place which will be big, and this and this and this and this. The Jordanian authority, highest authority, published a statement saying that they are absolutely against Sharansky's attempt to build a legal settlement near the Western Wall. So they use the word settlement. For them, the non-Orthodox prayer near the Western Wall, whether the platform will be touching the Western Wall, was illegal settlement.
It's a word that's been weaponized against us.
Yeah.
One of the fascinating things about this book, if you are not someone that is really aware of all the behind the scenes negotiations that occur in a political setting, you will be fascinated by watching the things that Natan Sharansky was able to accomplish, both in founding a political party, as a politician, and as head of the Jewish Agency. But in the middle of all of that, there was a basic fundamental approach to those negotiations, which was a feeling that, and a commitment that compromise was a necessary step to solidifying your standing, because if you don't, then you don't have a way of creating a common ground. So in your book, you pose a fascinating new structure, a global council that will affect this kind of compromise and build a better dialogue between diaspora Jewry and Israel. Can you give us a little bit more information about that global council that you propose?
Well, look, it's not something very specific, because the more specific it is, the less is a chance that people will start even discussing it. But the general idea is that, look, I wasn't in the Knesset and I was minister. So I know that when there is some question which is brought for the decision of the Knesset, which concerns your minister, I was minister of industry trade, for example, then the Union of Industrials and the Union of Tzarchanim, over the customers, and every specialist in this question will be invited to the Knesset for expressing their opinion. That's obligation. But when it comes to the questions which can influence on our relation with diaspora is never asked. And I said, what prevents us? Let's say Knesset is meeting, there are 3 sessions in the year. In the beginning of every session, you have also a meeting between the leaders of diaspora Jewry and the, let's say, 120 members of the Knesset. And all the questions which during this session are supposed to be brought for discussion, which in any way are going to touch the questions of our relations with diaspora, first of all, you have to hear their opinions. Maybe you will not agree. Maybe you will give them some rights in the committees or not. But first of all, listen to their opinion. For example, when there was a decision about not letting into the country those who are supporting boycott of Israel. So here are activists fighting against BDS day and night on the campuses. Was any of them invited to the Knesset to ask whether such a law will help to your struggle or will not help? But the same can be said about many Jewish organizations who are taking some important decisions which will for sure make some complication in their relations with the state of Israel, with the government of Israel. Again, I don't say that you have to accept what government says, especially if you don't like its policy. But at least to discuss publicly these arguments before you're making decision, isn't it something that will help to us better to understand where we disagree and where we can make one, maybe even small step towards one another?
John Locke talked about consent of the governed. And in the book, we talk about the fact that what often happens with Jews is there's the responsibility of the implicated, that somehow we're implicated by a decision the Israeli government makes, or as Natan points out, some Jewish organization makes, and we immediately have to either defend it or explain it. And we're under no illusions that if there's a global Jewish council, there wouldn't be disagreements. Of course there'd be disagreements, but if you at least feel like you had a chance to articulate your opinion, to have a little bit of investment in the conversation, that will improve your investment in the overall project. And the interesting thing is the book started very much as that. The book started as a kind of a memo to the Jewish world about the Global Jewish Council. And at a certain point, we realized that Natan was about to turn 70, the state of Israel was about to turn 70, both of them were born in 1948. And it was more important not just to address this issue, but to go with a deeper issue of really this, what we call memoirfesto, using moments in Natan's Zionist life to explain who we are, what we stand for as a people, what are our core values, and how we can try to build bridges. And that's really the way the book evolved from this focus on this Global Jewish Council to a broader issue of using his life story to share our values, our vision, to then ultimately using the Global Jewish Council as an expression of those shared visions, this hope for unity, this hope for dialogue without uniformity.
I want to thank both of you very much. We have come to the end of our scheduled time. So thank you to Natan Sharansky and thank you to Dr. Gil Troy for a frank discussion of the current issues that are facing Jerusalem and Zionism today. And we encourage all of you to acquire the book, Never Alone, and for you to have an opportunity to see and read more about their approach to pluralism. So I thank you all, and with that, we will conclude our webinar.
Thank you. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova to everybody.